Thanks everybody for joining today. Let me put up my slides here. I am happy to be talking to you about education for citizenship. Let's see if I can share the screen. All right. Andy, is that looking good?
It's in this, it's design mode still.
Oh, let's try. Is that one better now?
Bingo.
All right. So again, thanks everybody for joining us this evening. And thanks.
I can't hear the speaker now.
I also, Brian, you're on mute. Can you? Thank you.
Yes, I'm sorry. I don't know how that happened. It was not, and then it went to mute. You're still able to see the slides?
No, I'm in gallery view. Let me just check. No, you.
Oh no, the sharing went away too.
The sharing
Sorry.
dropped and then, so you may have to just start from the beginning again.
Try that again.
Yep. Okay.
How does that look?
Looks good.
All right. Thanks again, Andy, and sorry for the hiccups. So I'm pleased to be talking to you all this evening about education for citizenship. And as Andy was saying earlier, this is a small enough group that I'm happy to take questions along the way. In fact, I'd like this to be more of a discussion than a lecture. And just to give you fair warning, you may end up with more questions than answers when we're done, because I want to raise a lot of questions here, partly due to the limitations of the existing research. So many of you probably know Horace Mann, famous across the country, especially famous here in Massachusetts, as the founder of public education almost 200 years ago. And Horace argued that preparation for citizenship is the first purpose of public education. It's the reason we all pay taxes to support public schools. It's the reason we don't just rely on private markets to support education. So Mann argued that the qualification of voters is as important as the qualification of governors, that every person, by the power of reason and the sense of duty, shall become fit to be a voter. Education must bring the practice as nearly as possible to the theory. So if you were thinking in terms of economists, the point here is that education is a public good. So we pay taxes to support education, not just because we want kids to be able to get good jobs and support themselves as adults, but more importantly, that they have to be voters as adults, and that there's a public benefit to all the voters being well educated. What you also may know as a historical matter is that the system of what in the 19th century was called common schooling was proposed by Horace Mann and other early founders to promote civic preparation, where the idea was that each community would have common schools, and they were common in the sense that they were free of tuition, they were open to everybody, and they were under the control of elected officials. And Mann thought that the common school may become the most effective of all forces of civilization. The basic idea was that the common schools would serve this public purpose of educating citizens because they were publicly operated and open to all in the community. Now, in my view, and I think there probably isn't a whole lot of disagreement about this now. The civic purpose of education is still important in the 21st century. And in fact, I would argue it's more important in the 21st century than it was in the 19th century when Horace Mann was around. The nation and the world are a whole lot more complex and more intertwined now than they were in 1855. We as humans have a far greater impact on each other and on our shared environment than people did in the 19th century. Climate change, of course, is the paradigm of kind of the public impact of our individual actions, but it's certainly not the only one. We, in general, have more ability to have an impact on each other than when folks lived in a largely agricultural society. And of course, democratic deliberation is under threat today in a way that has not been seen, at least in our lifetimes prior to this. We're living in an era of division and deception when too many citizens, too many political leaders seem unable to participate in civil deliberation and compromise, which are, you might think, essential ingredients in well-functioning democracies. So put all these things together, and education for citizenship, I think, is even more important now than it was at the time that the common schools were created and that the public education system in America was established. Now, today, of course, you're all hearing, I'm sure, lots of big arguments about what should be going on in the public schools. Just in the last couple of years, really, since the pandemic started, controversies about what schools are teaching have become much more heated than they were before that. And those things are real. You know, I put up as examples here the New York Times' 1619 project trying to reframe the founding and focus more on the way that enslavement was a very important part of early America. You had a response to that from the Trump administration creating a 1776 commission that wanted to put a much more favorable view of the founding. You have now lots of very heated debates over things like critical race theory and gender identity. But the good news is, or at least in my view, there's some good news here, which is that there's still lots of consensus in other areas. So here I'm showing some results from some opinion polling. This is not my work, but this is out there in the field. Some opinion polling about what Americans think should be included in history textbooks. And it turns out that although they disagree, and these are partisan differences, Democrats in blue, Republicans in red, the averages are in gray. If you look at the issues on the right side of the graph, there's some real partisan disagreement. Democrats and Republicans tend to disagree a good bit on the history of the gay rights movement, on the concept of white privilege, especially.
Does that include independents, or is that just Democrats and Republicans?
That is a good question. So my understanding, so the gray bar is all Americans. So presumably that would include some independents. And we don't have a separate, I don't know what the separate numbers for independents by themselves would be.
Yeah, I wish they would tell us whether they just did Democrat
something in between, or
because that's not that would be a significant, I would think, difference in outcome if independents or non-Democrats and Republicans were included, and I'd be curious to know.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that they did include more than just Democrats and Republicans. I mean, I think that's implicit in the label here that says the gray bar is all Americans, which would not just be Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah, because like in the federal government's role, the all Americans is lower than both Democrats and Republicans, and you couldn't have that if they weren't included. So you're right.
Good point. Thank you. You have a sharp eye. Thanks, Pamela. In any case, the thing that's interesting here is that at least in these first three categories, where you might expect to see some partisan disagreement, there's very little partisan disagreement. So even the Republicans think, even the vast majority of Republicans think that the history textbook should talk about how the US government forcibly removed Native Americans from their land. That many of the founders were slave holders. That the federal government had a role in creating internment camps for Japanese Americans during the Second World War. There are substantial disagreements, but not on everything. And I think that the media coverage, which naturally tends to focus on the disagreements, sometimes obscures the fact that there's quite a bit of agreement, which, from my perspective as a researcher, I mean, first of all, I think it's encouraging as a policy matter that there's the possibility of having some consensus on at least some of these issues. But beyond that, what it means is that we can actually use empirical evidence to inform the discussion about what are the best ways to educate citizens. If there was no agreement on the values at all, then the empirical evidence would sort of be irrelevant, right? I mean, then you're just arguing about ideology. But if you've got some agreement, then at least you can start asking questions about, well, if we agree on some of these issues, then what are the best ways to prepare citizens in the 21st centuries? Structurally, are the common schools, that idea that Horace Mann came up with a couple of 100 years ago, are they the best? Is that the best way to organize and govern education to promote citizenship? What would be the implications of a different kind of system that had greater diversity in schooling, greater, a sort of more pluralist kind of approach? And how would we know if we were thinking about what would we try to measure in order to understand whether schools and what kinds of schools are doing a good job in preparing citizens? And finally,
if we don't fund them equally, I mean, our whole, how can we answer those questions for the current school system, since it's funded with property taxes, which guarantees inequality and segregation by economic?
So yes, there's quite a bit of segregation. There's quite a bit of inequality. I think that even in that context, though, you can ask questions about what are the better, what are good ways of educating citizens. So these are some of the questions I want to talk about. And as I mentioned, some of them I don't think we really have answers to yet, but they're, I think, the sort of things that are worth thinking deeply about and trying to study some more, I hope. So I want to talk just for a few minutes about this kind of governance and structure question, in part because this is something that I've actually done some original empirical research on. And so one thing to keep in mind, of course, is that the ideal of the common school that Horace Mann proposed has often not been met in practice over the nearly 200 years since they were established. And furthermore, even at the beginning, there are good reasons to ask the questions about what they were aiming for in preparing students for citizenship. So you can find a good bit of evidence that some of the early motives also included essentially control over usually, lower income folks, immigrants. Parochial schools, Catholic parochial schools, were established mostly in the second half of the 19th century, in significant part in response to at least perceived anti-Catholic bias in supposedly common schools, and in many cases, probably real anti-Catholic bias. So the cartoon here on the right was an anti-Catholic cartoon in Harper's Weekly in 1875, depicting Catholic bishops as crocodiles attacking public schools. And that's the kind of thing that there was a good bit of that going around. So they also, of course, failed to live up to the ideal when it came to things like racial segregation. So it's worth, keeping in mind that the reality has often fallen short of the aspiration. In terms of social science evidence, there just isn't much out there on how good public schools are at promoting civic skills. There's been this assumption for 200 years that, again, because they're publicly operated under the control of democratically elected officials, that's why they're going to serve the public purpose of educating kids for citizenship. But that has, for the most part, that assumption has not really been empirically examined. Now, we do know that more education tends to increase civic participation. There are a variety of good studies showing that, just in general, getting more years of education in high school, higher ed, and beyond tends to promote increased civic participation. But there's not really any evidence that the common schools, the conventional public schools, have any particular advantage in that. And in fact, there's some suggestive research from a few different studies that suggests some advantages for what you might call uncommon schools. Some studies suggest that Catholic schools seem to increase civic participation. Others have found independent private schools may do better. Others have just found no differences between public and private. So this kind of raises the question about, well, do you have to have public governance, democratic control over the schools to serve that civic purpose, to promote citizenship? And charter schools are a really interesting case here, because charter schools, as you may know, are essentially they're public schools that are privately operated, right? They are authorized by a public agency. They are not allowed to charge tuition. They're not allowed to discriminate in admissions. So they're public in a couple of senses of the word, but they're not under the direct control of elected school boards, the way that the traditional common schools are. And that kind of approach is consistent with broader systems that are in place in many countries around the world, in much of Europe and various other places in the world. There are pluralistic systems of public education. In the United States, at least prior to the creation of charter schools, the definition of a public school was sort of owned and operated by the local government. That is not the definition of a public school in many places, where schools are publicly funded and publicly regulated, but not necessarily publicly operated. And so you have many countries around the world that subsidize privately operated schools, including in some places religious schools in many places. Now, charter schools are not religious schools, but they do represent this idea that you can have a public school that is privately operated. And I came across a decade or so ago a charter school management organization, a nonprofit charter school management organization that started in New York City called Democracy Prep Public Schools. As you can see here, their motto: work hard, go to college, change the world. So I thought, this is really cool. This is an interesting case where you've got these charter schools, privately operated, publicly funded, open to the public, that have an explicit mission of promoting skills for citizenship, of promoting democracy, even though they are in some sense uncommon, right? They're not operated by the local government. Now, there's been some research.
That we're
Pardon?
still on. You said, as you can see here, their motto. We don't see that.
Is that you don't see that underneath the Democracy Prep Public Schools? Is that
Oh, okay. Yes.
okay?
Very tiny. I'm sorry, I missed it.
Yeah, sorry, it is a little small there. There has been some research at the state level, at least, suggesting that charter high schools may have some advantages in promoting civic participation, voting, and registration after the students are 18, typically no longer students at that point. But we did a study that looked specifically at democracy prep, and as a kind of really interesting case study, since that's their explicit aim. And it turns out that enrolling in a democracy prep charter school produced large positive impacts on the probability that those students, again, years later, these are students who typically enrolled in democracy prep either in 5th or 6th grade at the beginning of middle school or 9th grade at the beginning of high school. So we were able to follow them until they were 18 and eligible to vote, and found that they were 16 percentage points. They had 16 percentage points higher registration rates and 12 percentage points higher voting rates than a comparison group than you would have expected if they had not enrolled in these schools. So, and those, in the world of education research, those are really big effects. That's a context in which 18-year-olds in general in the United States tend to vote at rates of maybe 40% or less. So 16 percentage points more than that for registration, 12 percentage points more than that for voting is a substantial impact. The state study that I mentioned, this was not ours, but also looks like that there was a for charter schools in general, not democracy prep in particular, saw at least a small positive effect on voting, and also some evidence of a small reduction in crime. But of course, there are other questions we might ask that we don't have data on about, for example, are there civic effects of common schools on their own communities? So, in these studies, we're looking at the effects on the kids who enroll, but of course, one other aspect of common schools that would not be true typically of charter schools is that as locally governed and operated schools, they may serve roles in their communities relative to democracy that could have impacts not just on their own students, but on other folks in their communities. So why don't I pause there and just ask if anybody has any questions about that research, about this general question. Mostly what I'm trying to do here is just is just raise the point that there might not be a necessary connection between the public operation of the schools and the public purpose of preparing the students for citizenship.
Could I ask or make a comment about, I went to the Horace Mann training school for grammar school in Salem,
really?
Massachusetts, during the Second World War. I'm an old guy, 88
Wow.
years old now. But I have to say that I don't recall learning much of anything about citizenship in grammar
Mhm.
school. I don't recall learning anything about. It seemed to me I learned that the indigenous population were cruel people. They didn't say it directly, but there was things around indicating that they were really terrible people who tortured white people who were captured. That none of the things that people thought were important were mentioned in the school. Now, I am politically active and very interested now. I don't know how it happened, but I don't remember much of anything explicit being taught about that in grammar school. We learned skills. We learned how to do things, do this, do that. Learned obscure physical skills and manual training, things like that, but nothing about that whether the founders of the country kept slaves. That was not mentioned, and all sorts
Yeah.
of things were just not covered.
Yeah, that's a great. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm done.
That's interesting. I went to school at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, in the public school there. And so that was in the South, but it was an intellectual community built during World War II. And I had, in Oak Ridge High School, had a program called Combined Studies, which was English literature and history and government put together, team taught. And I got a lot of this information from it, and including the importance of getting politically active. I can still remember my teacher saying, choose a party, get involved and vote. Doesn't matter which one, just do it. That's your civic duty. And we got permission to read actual history, a lot about the founding of the country that was not allowed. We had to get permission from our parents to like read War and Peace. And about the economic reasons for the revolution, as opposed to the freedom and taxation without representation nonsense. But we still get an accurate view of slavery and native genocide and all of these things. And when we divide up by race and teach things that white people did this instead of the powerful in charge did this, then I think we end up, I don't think that's the right way to teach it either, because the will to dominate is a human nature thing, a tribal thing, not a racial thing or a national thing. And I don't think you can talk about it that way even now. How do we get people to talk about things that they really don't agree with?
Yeah, that's a challenge.
Into schools.
In any case, it sounds like at least in some ways, Pamela, your school was ahead of its time in and I suspect that many folks had an experience more like what Paul described.
Also, my
you-
school, that program was only for the elite.
Oh, really? Okay.
It wasn't for everybody.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that sort of misses the point then. If since presumably since everybody's going to turn 18, everybody's going to be eligible to vote.
Yeah, my
in
sister
any
didn't
case,
take combined studies. She took regular history and regular English, and that wasn't half as good.
yeah. And Paul, I think your experience to me illustrates two important points. One is that for too much of history, we've kind of neglected the civic purposes of education. And you can see at many points in our history, the debates about education are about, whether we are going to be smart enough to compete with China, for example, or whether they tend to be put when they're discussed in the national conversation at all, it more often is about economics than it is about citizenship. And so that I think has been too often neglected. And then the second point is that, the common schools for most of our history did not teach, the kind of full, did not teach everybody's history, right? I mean, they didn't teach a lot of the things that happily today, Americans recognize that they should be teaching, like whether the founders were slave owners and the establishment of camps for Japanese Americans during the war and the removal of Native Americans, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
So I think there's some progress on these things, but presumably quite a long ways to go still as well.
I wanted to
Oh
just
yeah, go ahead.
I
Mhm.
grew up in the same, I'm Paul's sister, and I went to the same school. And I remember in first grade, this is a public school, the Bible was read in a public school.
Uh-huh.
That's pretty unusual, but I too
Mhm.
did not know about slaves being owned by George Washington and Jefferson, etc. And the same with the Indians. I had the same, it was the cowboys and Indians, and the Indians were bad.
Yeah.
And, the Thanksgiving story was very different
Yep.
than it might have been, that it was, I guess. Right.
Yep. Well, I'm only 54 and I didn't learn most of those things.
And the
in school,
Japanese
so-
business I didn't know about either. There's
Yep.
so much I didn't know about, but there were good parts to our education as well.
That's good.
I think I have good memories of that, although I didn't learn some of the things I probably should have in those first 8 years or
We
whatever it
did
was.
learn about the moral issues of the Civil War, I think. And we developed strong feelings about the rightness of the North side by singing. We learned this by singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic in assemblies. It was very moving. I still remember it very vividly.
That's great. Okay.
That was citizenship.
So the next question I wanted to ask is, how can we know what works? What would we try to look at to understand whether the schools are doing a good job at preparing students for citizenship? And I argue that part of the problem here, part of the reason we don't know much about this is that, you can take this with a grain of salt if you want. I am an education researcher after all, but in my view, the country has had a century-long underinvestment in education research and development. So here's just a little comparison here. The budget of the Institute of Education Sciences as compared with the budget of the National Institutes of Health. Okay, so the Institute of Education Sciences, which you may not have even heard of because is not as well known as the National Institutes of Health, but it's the research arm of the U.S. Department of Education. And the allocation it gets in the federal budget every year amounts to about 0.1% of all the spending on K-12 schools nationally. So in percentage terms, we're not investing a lot in R&D, and then in absolute terms, NIH gets about $45 billion a year. IES and education, the parallel agency, gets less than $1 billion. So that tiny little red bar, the blue bar, is the comparison. The Institute of Education Sciences has existed for about 20 years now. In my view, it has done a good job at improving the rigor and the quality of education research, but it doesn't have the resources to have a really broad scope to include lots of things related to things like civics education, as well as many, many other things. And one way I note this, the fact that we don't have enough education research, is that probably the single biggest research finding in education policy research in the last 20 years is the finding that says teachers matter. Well, this is a finding, of course, that any parent or student probably could have told you, right? We now have good quantitative evidence of it, which is nice. But even then, we haven't been able to figure out exactly how teachers matter. We know that, individual teachers can produce large effects, but the investment in research has not been sufficient yet for us to come up with good scientific information about what it is that makes some teachers much more effective than others. So we need to invest more in research, I think, in education in general, but more specifically on the civic purposes of education. And that means we're going to have to come up with some more measures of the kinds of things that are relevant to civic outcomes. Education studies of the impacts of educational programs, tend to look at math and reading test scores as the outcomes. And mostly we researchers look at those because that's the data we've got. That's the data we can get, because states test kids in math and reading every year. Occasionally they test kids in science. Many of them don't test kids in social studies or history or civics at all. The National Assessment of Educational Progress, the one national assessment, does math and reading every 2 years, but they very rarely measure civics or history or economics. So, the question is, what are the skills, attitudes, and knowledge that are necessary for effective citizenship, and how might we be able to measure them? Go ahead.
And even if we did know what teachers did, you can have the best teacher in the world, and if they're not allowed to, if they're forced to teach a really bad curriculum, the outcome's not good. And every time we have tests that measure broader things than really narrowly objective reading and math, we get huge pushback of, there's too much testing going on and that's not education, and you can't manage what you don't measure, and we're not allowed to measure. How we do things matters. I read a book, The Smartest Kids in the World. It's about several education systems, and I believe Hungary, Finland, the one that is number one in the world. And they managed to educate non-native speaking kids magnificently.
Yeah, I think that there are definitely some things we could learn from some of those international comparisons.
And we study them. And the first thing they had to do was develop a test that they could use to measure outcomes, so they could find out where the best ones were. And we could use that test. There's just look at the controversy about the MCAS tests here in Massachusetts.
Mhm.
I
Yeah,
think-
we could definitely talk some more about that. We actually, we did some research on MCAS a few years ago when they were considering replacing it. But
So did they come out, let's replace it or what?
no. So the MCAS, as compared to many state assessments, the MCAS is pretty good as compared to assessments in many other states. At the time, they were considering replacing it with one of these consortium design tests. It turned out that both of them were pretty good at predicting how well students would do in college classes, which seems like a reasonably good measure of, not looking at civic purposes at all, but at least predicting how well they do later in college classes. There was a question about whether the standards were high on the MCAS, and they could have been a little bit higher. But otherwise, as tests go, it's not a bad one. But what are the sort of things we might want to measure, and what would be the implications for, you mentioned the curriculum is important, and it is indeed important. So I just want to throw out a few possibilities here. Feel free to chime in here. If we were to, as a country, as a state, if we were to focus more on the civic purpose, the civic preparation, and if we were to think about things we'd want to measure beyond reading and math test scores, presumably we'd be interested in students' civic knowledge, history, social studies, basics of government and economics. One of the problems that has happened with tests in some schools over the last couple of decades is that because they are almost exclusively in math and reading, too many schools have sort of neglected the subjects that aren't tested, like civics, history, social studies. And it's important to push back against that. Civic skills, some of the civic skills might be a little different in the 21st century than they were in the 19th. Some of them are probably the same, respectful debate maybe being one of them. But media literacy, for example, is a much bigger deal in the internet age than it was, with maybe a once a week broadsheet or something that people might have had to read in the 19th century. Tolerance, civic attitudes presumably are important as well. So in any case, you could imagine, first of all, attention to knowledge, skills, and attitudes that might be relevant to citizenship preparation that we could be thinking about. Any others that anybody'd like to nominate here to be included there? Yeah,
Oh,
go
yeah.
ahead.
Conflict resolution,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
mediation. We have to learn how to handle fights.
Yep.
I think we need and statistics.
I'm with you there. We'll
Statistics
get
and
to that.
probability.
Thank
The
you.
ignorance is incredible. And
Yes.
economics, how economic system dynamics work.
Yep.
And
Wait a couple minutes and we'll get to.
We need to have word problems in every field.
Mm-hmm.
Goes across the fields. Because we're not. That's the kind of knowledge we need. We need to learn about things that we don't intuitively do well.
Yep. I totally agree.
Conflict resolution, psychology, statistics, and probability, particularly probability. I mean, you mentioned Bayes. Most people don't even know who that is. And estimates we don't teach.
Thank you. You're leading very nicely into some points I want to make in a minute, because I do think that I've long felt that we need changes in the math curriculum that would definitely be relevant to civic preparation, and probability and statistics is kind of the key, in my view, the key thing we should be addressing.
Could I bring up another issue that
Please
as
do.
I recall, we were encouraged to be patriotic. We, at least in my first school, you know, we saluted the flag, and we were, in a sense, we were encouraged to be patriotic. But there are an awful lot of bad things that happen in American history, like enslavement, which I just discovered yesterday was enslavement here in Concord. And we had, there are a whole lot of bad things that went on in this country. And so the more you hear about the bad things, which many of which, three things we were going to be encouraged to learn according to that pile. But those things detract from one's patriotism, it seems to me. They say, oh, this country isn't so great after all. There was all kinds of bad people in the beginning. There are nasty things that happen.
And if we learn history, we learn that that's universal. And I think nationalism, like you said, patriotism, that's a pretty big evil. It contradicts our humanity, global humanity, which we need in order to get along without warfare. Fascists rely on nationalism in their rise to power.
Yeah. So thank you. So let me go on and just throw out a few more ideas for thought about, well, what are the ways that we might try to promote civic preparation. So one example is whether students in school should have more opportunities to practice citizenship. Should they have more agency about their own choices for their educational program, for their use of time? Should they have some ability to play a role in decisions about the operation of the school? And I like this example. This is a secondary school, middle and high school grades, a regular public school in Arlington, Virginia, called H.B. Woodlawn. It's been around for almost 50 years, and it was established specifically to create an environment in which students would have a lot more agency and authority. They have, the school holds town meetings, I think, every week, in which students have a say in the governance. Now, nobody's ever done a study of this to see what effects it has. I would love to do one at some point, but it raises an interesting question about whether, there are ways, even apart from kind of explicit curriculum, there are ways to design how a school operates to give kids the opportunity to practice citizenship in ways that might prepare them later. I particularly like this one because my baby sister happens to be a teacher there. So I have a little personal stake in that. The next thing then goes to the point you were making a minute ago, Pamela, about statistics and probability. I really think that citizens need good analytic skills to make better judgments, make better decisions, better understand the world, make better predictions.
They are all required to read Thinking Fast and Slow in high school. Because we need behavioral economics. It's the cross between psychology and history and math.
Yep. That's right. And that's a lot about what I put up here, an organization that I've just been learning about recently, just been connected with recently, the Alliance for Decision Education. And they are promoting the advancement of that kind of knowledge in schools. So, effective quantitative reasoning, numeracy, is the way that OECD has defined it. Effective mathematical decision-making require understanding of quantification and measurement, of expected value, of variability in the distributions of outcomes, including distributions that don't look like a bell curve, but have long tails, understanding probability, risk, uncertainty, Bayesian reasoning, understanding how to present and interpret data, all of this kind of stuff. Better causal inference, understanding the difference between correlation and causality, for example. And, if you look at state standards in mathematics and curricula in mathematics, some of this will be in there, but in my view, not nearly enough. We probably should be willing to discard some things, maybe trigonometry, for example. We probably should be willing to. The high school math curriculum in the country has been mostly unchanged for 100 years. And it's almost entirely directed toward calculus, which is great if you're going to be an engineer. But for citizens in general, statistics and probability, are important, not just for your work, but for your everyday lives and for understanding the world. And so I think it could be incredibly valuable to try to move that change.
And logic,
Pardon?
logic too.
Yes, sure. So a little example here, an indication of how we still have a long way to go toward numeracy. This is an excuse to bring in some of my own recent work. The reason to bring this in is just to point out that even the National Center for Education Statistics misinterprets statistical results sometimes. So as I mentioned earlier, the National Assessment of Educational Progress is it's called the nation's report card sometimes. It gets publicity when results come out every 2 years. Last fall, the first new results came out since the pandemic began, and there were big news stories about it because there were huge declines in math and reading scores across the country. That was the first story, and the news reporters got that right. The National Center for Education Statistics got that right. The second, if you dug deeper into the stories, the second story was about looking at variation across the country, not just the national averages, but differences in states and in the 26 urban districts that participate in the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And here is where a lot of the news stories, the local news stories on some of the local results, some of the national news stories got things wrong, based in large part because of the way, unfortunately, the National Center for Education Statistics reported these results. So when they reported results for individual states and districts, and here I'm showing you the 26 urban districts, this one happens to be fourth grade reading. They reported whether each of these cities had a statistically significant decline since 2019 to 2022, pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, whether they had a statistically significant increase or whether they did not have a significant change. And significant has this technical meaning in statistics, but basically the stories ended up saying that any districts that did not, or states that did not have a significant change were holding steady. That's not actually what it means. If you don't have a statistically significant change, it basically just means we don't know what. But this was interpreted by some folks as looking for bright spots, where a bright spot was identified as a place that the change happened to be not statistically significant. In fact, the declines were much more universal than reported, which you could determine by reanalyzing their results using Bayesian methods. And so the chart on the left is what was originally reported, where among these 26 districts, 9 had declines and 17 weren't significantly different. None had increases. When you do the reanalysis and look at whether the declines are actually meaningful and substantial and likely, turns out that 17 of the 26 had educationally meaningful declines. 8 more had probably small declines. 1 probably had a small increase. But the general point is that this was reported in a way that really confused people. And if the National Center for Education Statistics is getting this wrong, we definitely have a long way to go. That was a lot, quite a ways to go to the side. But does anybody, just before I go on, does anybody have any questions about those results? Okay, we'll. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
It's just so discouraging.
Yeah, we're gonna do better.
Educational reporting, the reporting by
Right.
journalism on every topic,
Yep.
any scientific topic
Yep.
is really bad. Look at the reporting on the pandemic.
Yep.
The reporting
Yep.
on AIDS during the AIDS.
Yep. So I want to go to one last thing here. With one last sort of possible policy intervention related to preparing students for citizenship. And this is about human capital, the teaching profession. So, given the things we've talked about, what kids need to know in the 21st century to be effective citizens in our democracy, this is going to make much greater demands of teachers than in the past. Social studies teachers, history teachers, civics teachers need to be able to teach with greater nuance than they did in the past. They need to figure out how they can teach about, the good things that the founding fathers did at the same time that they, acknowledge that some of them were enslavers. If we're going to improve math education in the ways that we just talked about, doing statistics and probability and things like that, that is an especially challenging human capital problem, because college students who are good at math rarely go into teaching. And they usually have opportunities, frankly, that pay a lot more than teaching does. So we've got to make the profession more attractive to them. The current state of the teaching profession is quite worrisome. So this is not my research. This is borrowed from a really nice recent paper by Matt Kraft and a colleague. And they put together various historical data sets looking at trends. The one on the left is percentage of parents who want their children to teach, give you a sense of the prestige of the profession. And you can see this huge decline just in the last 15 years. At the same time, if you look at the panel on the right, not surprisingly, there's been a huge decline in student interest in teaching. So this is the percentage of high school seniors who are interested in working in a school or university. So a somewhat broader question than just about teaching per se. But that trend over the last 15 years looks remarkably consistently negative across these two indicators related to the prestige of the profession and the attractiveness of the profession. I don't know if Bernie Sanders' proposal to make sure every teacher makes at least 60,000 is the right solution to this. I suspect we probably need more nuanced kinds of solutions, but
But
certainly
it's necessary, but not sufficient,
something
essential.
that might be right. Um, but we do have, I mean, if you look in the longer term, one of the unexpected and unintended consequences of the success of feminism has been that it's been harder to attract high achieving women into the profession. 60 years ago, 70 years ago, when women had fewer other options, more women from the top half of their college classes tended to go into teaching. And of course, we wouldn't want to keep restricting their options that way. But it's worth recognizing that that an implication of the fact that more women were able to become doctors and lawyers and engineers was that the ones going into teaching were less likely to come from the top half of their college class than they were in the past. And so the profession has to become more attractive. And I think that means pay. It probably means a lot of other things too, related to working conditions. So this is where I finished. I guess we still have some more time for additional conversation. And I just want to acknowledge here, as I said at the beginning, there will be more questions than answers, alas. But there's a lot that is yet to be learned about exactly what to do to effectively educate students for citizenship. So thank you all, and we can open it up now. Andy, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Could you drop your share screen?
Yes, I will do that.
And I just wanted to mention that thank you very much for the talk. It really illustrated a lot of things I hadn't really thought about before. But I just want to say, with the the recent pandemic, if you want to say 2 years, basically put a stop on our education process, and I think also did a horrible disservice to these young children, stopping their emotional development, subjecting them to some weird at home, parents working at home, the whole pandemic thing. What do you think the educational process, what can we do to try to repair that? Is there some way we can get over that? What, some remedy?
Yeah, that is a really tough one. The good news is that public schools across the country currently have a lot more resources to address it than they would have in the past. The Recovery Act a couple of years ago, in the wake of pandemic, put far more federal funding into public schools than had ever been available before, and that continues for another through, I think, the end of 2024. So there are some resources to do interventions, and there's a lot of variation in the kinds of things that different schools are doing, and a lot of discussion about how to do it well. One of probably the intervention that has gotten the most attention is what they tend to call high impact tutoring. Basically, that means tutoring that's done at least 3 times a week for a substantial number of weeks, with not more than about 3 kids at a time, ideally with a well-trained tutor and the same tutor across multiple times, ideally closely integrated with classroom discussion, with classroom instruction. There's quite a bit of research evidence that can be effective in improving student achievement. Now, there are some concerns about that too. One concern is that many schools and districts across the country are not finding kids signing up for it nearly as much as they would like. That may be in part because parents are less concerned about their own kids than the data suggests that they should be. But it might also be that there are other costs that are not just about the reading and math scores that parents are worried about, and that they are concerned about the trade-offs that have to be made. So you referred a minute ago to the kind of social and emotional harms related to the pandemic and school closures, and those are substantial too. There's not nearly as much clear evidence on how to solve that problem as there is to improve, say, reading and math test scores. And so sometimes there might be tough trade-offs. For example, we know that you tend to get more kids into tutoring if you do it during the school day, rather than requiring them to come, say, after school. But if you do it during the school day, that means you're taking them away from something else. And maybe that something else is important for their social emotional outcomes. Maybe it's important for their civic preparation. Hard to know. I am hopeful that schools across the country are, investing these federal resources in ways that will help. But it was a huge, since the National Assessment for Educational Progress has existed, there'd never been such a big decline in scores as there was, and there'd never been such a disruption to schooling. So it's not surprising. There is a real challenge in trying to figure out which aspect of this problem should we be focused on, and how much are the solutions complementary versus competing. It's a tough problem.
I think there's a lot of statistical evidence that the amount of time in school matters a whole lot. When they do these
yes.
tests at the beginning and the end of the year, then they can see how much kids backslid during summer vacation.
Mm-hmm.
And that was particularly illuminating in that it showed that kids from disadvantaged backgrounds in like Boston lost a lot during the summer, that kids that had reading and supports during the summer did not, but that they also made up a whole lot more during the school year. And so if you wanted more, then they came right back up. So they had a like the trees, the chlorophyll, that trees lose their leaves and the carbon dioxide goes down, and a seesaw matter as we go. So if we had year-round school, that would help. I mean, it wouldn't solve all the problems, but it would help. And if we had universal food, breakfasts and lunch, that would help. That kids didn't have to pay for it as a public good. And if we paid teachers, I wanted to be a teacher. I thought it was a profession. I taught school for 2 years in the 70s and found out right away that it wasn't a respected profession. My husband was a management consultant, and I made about as much as we paid in taxes each year for his job at the Boston Consulting Group. And it was a blue collar job. The unions were not interested in the quality of the education. They were only interested in protecting the union members from getting fired for any reason. It was a terrible bureaucracy. You can't get good people if you don't pay them well. And our
Yep.
society is paying the best pay goes to business graduates and entrepreneurs and the financial industry, which doesn't create anything.
Yeah.
And
So I, as I finished the presentation on the human capital issue, I think that improved compensation for teachers has to be part of the solution. I think there's also there's a whole lot of other things that are.
yeah, we need the unions to be somehow aligned with the quality of the education of the kids and not just the jobs of the teachers.
Pamela, Pamela, thank you. Brian, great speech. I had lots of questions too, but I think you covered more than you expected to in this talk. So very good. So we will be putting this on our YouTube channel, and in a couple of days you should be able to access it. Thank you, everybody, for tonight, and I'll see you next month.
Okay, thank you.
Brian,
Thank you.
Sarah, do you
Interesting
have
talk.
other programs? Is there a way? I'm interested in more of what you're doing. Is there a way we